I'm curious what y'all think about Max McLean. Do you like him? Yeah? He's way more entertaining than me or anyone else. So I'm glad you like him. I might continue to do that. So we are still in Mark's Gospel, much to my delight. And as I mentioned last week, the Gospel of Mark is written by a man who's in a hurry. So we have a lot of stuff that is crammed into each passage of the narrative lectionary for us. But another thing about Mark, his gospel, it's about healing and forgiveness, but it's also a lot of conflict and confrontation. It's described as a very raw kind of gospel. And you notice Jesus is not presented as sweet and nurturing per se. He's not sitting there with baby sheep and rainbows. He's pushing boundaries. He's constantly setting the religious leaders on edge. He's telling these cryptic and strange parables. And in Mark's gospel, Jesus, he's not really come to be friends with everybody or be a people pleaser. He has come to make things right. And he does not really give a care in the world about what the religious leaders think. And he's pretty fearless in this gospel. A tad rude sometimes, and he's really not wasting any time at all. And in Mark especially, Jesus has a kind of bad habit of making statements that could be construed as taking honor away from the one true God, which was a really quick way to put a target on yourself. But I wanted to retell the story for today and give a little more detail that Mark might leave out in his hurry to finish the chapter. So we come to this story. Some days later, Jesus had come back to Denver. And everyone heard about it, and they flocked to that Airbnb in Wash Park where he was staying. And people filled this Airbnb. They crammed it so tight it violated the fire code. People just wanted to see this miraculous man. And then these 4 friends show up, these fraternity brothers. And they hadn't camped out the night before like everyone else, and so there was no way they were getting in that Airbnb to see Jesus. But they had to see him. They were desperate. Their 5th friend, he had been hit by a car and paralyzed from the waist down. And this is already a devastating injury for anyone, but this man, his career was construction. And since the accident, he'd been surviving on disability checks and kind of aimlessly wandering through life, wondering what on earth he was supposed to do now. He had lost his purpose, lost his bearings. He didn't know what to do. And he had a wheelchair, but this Airbnb had no handicap accessibility, and his wheelchair can't even fit through the door. And he said, just turn around, guys. This is not meant to be. This is not worth it. But his fraternity brothers, they were not ready to give up yet. And they found some sturdy rope, and they took that fire escape stairwell up to the roof, carrying that bulky wheelchair the whole way. And people outside were like, what are these guys doing? And then these friends did the unthinkable. They took a large hammer to the roof. And Jesus was inside, and he heard the building shake, and dust started falling from the ceiling. And then all of a sudden, a loud crash as pieces of drywall fall from the ceiling and go to the floor. And slowly, the man in the wheelchair is lowered down until the wheels touch down. And Jesus was amazed. The Airbnb owner was furious. The crowd, whose hair and faces, they were covered in dust, they just stared in shock with their mouths open. Surely Jesus would condemn destroying property just to selfishly get their friend inside. But Jesus' smile was so big. Your sins are wiped clean, he said, smiling at their faith. And now the religious elite, they were in the corner because they always had these front row tickets to see Jesus at any of these appearances. And their faces turned to frowns, and their stomachs kind of dropped. Who is this guy to say that sins are forgiven? Even though the Catholic priest had just forgiven sins yesterday in the confession booth. But this was blasphemous, they thought. This ordinary man, not ordained, claiming to be God, and supporting the destruction of public property. And Jesus felt the hair on the back of his neck prick up, and his ears started to burn, and he knew he was the subject of their discussion. "Are you troubled by what I'm saying?" he said very loudly. And they just stood there in their robes, and their collars, their stoles, and their faces turned red. "What's easier for you?" Jesus asked, with a great deal of sass in his voice. Telling a man his sins are wiped clean, or telling him to stand up out of his wheelchair and get up and walk? And he turned to the man and said, "Stand up, fold up your wheelchair, and walk out." And suddenly the man in the wheelchair, he felt feeling in his legs again. He felt them kind of tingling. And he tried to lift one foot, and lo and behold, he could lift it. And his heart was pounding. And he lifted the other foot, and he placed both of them firmly on the ground, covered in drywall dust. And he stood up, feeling stronger than he ever felt. And everyone was amazed. But the religious elite stood in their corner, their mouths open. And Jesus, he had noticed immediately at the start of his ministry that there was this clash between the old ways and the new. And he thought, this is going to be an uphill battle. And nearly every place he went, every healing that took place, there stood those titans of the old ways, criticizing his ministry and calling him a heretic. And he had only been in ministry for 6 months, and he was getting tired of it. He was ready for a sabbatical. Their criticism and their judgment was wearing on him because they were completely missing the point of what he was doing. So a few weeks later, he's walking along Cherry Creek Reservoir. And the park rangers, they were so impressed with him that he just got in for free. And a whole gaggle of people followed him. And everyone driving around in their cars trying to kayak at the lake, they got annoyed with this huge group of people walking in their way. And he was teaching and answering their questions. He was such a good teacher. And there on this bench sat a defense lawyer. This lawyer kept criminals on the streets. His cases helped him buy a second mansion in the mountains. And his cases made headlines, but not for good reasons. And he had just won a big case for a notorious criminal. But today, he did not feel that normal joy he felt as he got a large paycheck. And so he came to the park to just sit, watch the birds, and smoke a cigarette, even though he swore he was going to quit. "I don't know," he just said to himself. "It just feels like my life is empty, despite having everything I could ever want." And then he started hearing a large crowd of people talking excitedly. And leading it was this man that had been in all the papers for these healings and claiming to have the power of God. And the lawyer just assumed this guy was a crackpot who made up stuff. But there was this intriguing air about him, a magnetizing kind of sense that made you want to sit down and have coffee with him. The lawyer, Levi was his name, he looked at Jesus, but he turned away quickly when they made eye contact. He didn't mean to stare, but then he heard a voice. And this voice washed comfort over him, as if it was his father speaking to him who hadn't been alive in years. And he turned, and it was this man, Jesus, and he just said 2 words, "Follow me." And even though Levi had totally thought this guy was a loon, seeing him in person just changed everything. The sound of his voice made him feel like suddenly his life had meaning, that he was created for being more than a defense lawyer, that he wasn't stuck in this life, but there was a different way to live. And his heart swelled, and he got up. And excitedly, he invited Jesus to dinner at his home, although he expected Jesus to have plenty of dinner invitations to choose from. And Jesus smiled at him and treated him like he was the only person in the whole world. And much to Levi's surprise, he accepted. And later on at his house, Levi had called up his friends, other high-profile lawyers and judges, just because he was so excited for them to meet this man. And the crowd had followed Jesus to Levi's house, and these wealthy lawyers were dining and chatting with people of all religious denominations and economic classes, Muslims eating with Jews, CEOs eating with fast food workers, Christians eating with atheists. True communion was happening here. But there in the corner, the religious elite were there. How did they find him? The titans of the old ways had found their way in. And they found one of Jesus' close friends, and they singled him out and asked snidely, "If this Jesus guy is so righteous and blameless, why does he eat with these people who don't follow the strict laws in the Bible? Why does he eat with those who don't even practice our religion, the right religion? Why does he eat with these lawyers who make their money off of doing the wrong thing? Why is he eating with the worst people?" Jesus, he had ears like a fruit bat. He could hear everything. And like every beautiful moment in his ministry, there were these religious elite trying to pin him down with a crime. But now they were harassing his close friend, and that's just not going to happen. And with an edge in his voice, he said loudly, "I did not come here for those who are well and full in the Spirit. I came for you who need me, those who need a Savior, the people that you ignore and condemn." Once again, the old ways were clashing with the new ways that Jesus brought to the table, and Jesus knew that it was time to address it. But then some others in the crowd asked out of mere curiosity why Jesus didn't fast like his cousin, John. Many Christians fasted on the Sabbath day, and they prayed 3 times a day. "Okay," Jesus said, "guests at a wedding don't fast while the groom is there." And everyone just stared back at him with really weird looks on their faces. "But when the groom is taken," Jesus said, "then it is time to fast and mourn." Crickets. No idea what he was talking about. What did he mean there? "I am teaching some new things," he said. "Maybe that's why it can be hard for you to hear. Combining the new and the old is never easy. You don't use a new piece of cloth when you're patching an old garment. You would not have known this, but Jesus was an excellent seamstress." And just the women in the crowd nodded. "Okay," Jesus said, "more relatable example. You don't put new, unfermented wine in old wineskins, do you?" But he just got blank looks. "Okay, you don't put a brand new self-driving engine from a self-driving car in a T-model Ford, do you? You don't take a hard drive from an old desktop computer and put it in a brand new laptop, do you? You can't even put a CD drive in a MacBook computer anymore." And everyone in the room suddenly understood. But the religious elite glared with contempt, and I don't entirely blame them. Jesus was a bit forthright there, as he tends to be. And what was he implying? That his way was the only way? Was he tossing out all traditions that endured for centuries, saying that they were irrelevant and unusable? Not exactly. But he was implying that the new and the old, if they are to be combined, they have to be combined with care. But Jesus' trouble with these religious leaders, this tension created with this different way of ministry, rubbing up against those established traditions of religion, this is nothing new. But never mind. The old and the new never mix well in secular worlds or religious ones. I mean, for example, the older generations, they tend not to mix that well with younger generations, and vice versa, because like it or not, change is constant in our life. And those of you who are a few generations younger or older, they've had different experience and they see the world differently. I think that the old and the new not mixing well together is a big reason for a lot of conflict in our country. So the social change movements, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, or religious changes, like our church becoming opening and affirming, I've noticed generations, they don't really listen to each other, and they just speak angrily about one another because they aren't taking the time to understand the perspectives. And I've seen the old being threatened by the social movements brought by the new, and I've seen the new spew angrily at the old for being obtuse without actually listening to them. And the old and the new, they have divided our country and religious life. Wineskins have burst, garments have been torn. I think of worship traditions, because I'm a pastor. The traditions of the Christian church, they're really often appreciated and revered by young people like me. Lots of research in worship suggests that young people, they don't actually want, like the fancy smoke machines, the rock show vibes of contemporary worship. They just want a simple sanctuary with some candles and authenticity from their religion. But often the older generation, they have a hard time with the new theology or new ways of thinking that come with the change in demographic. And often the young people leave because they feel misunderstood. And then the older generation comes up to the pastor and asks, why aren't more young people in the church? The old and the new, they don't mix easily. And I see it here in this very service that we do. In the service, it'll be a year old in March. It's not been that long. And it's an uphill battle for me to change church culture and recognize this service as Calvary's second worship service, not a church plant. We're not a new church that rents this space and meets here, but it often can feel like that. And I've had to correct my own language, and I am in charge of this whole thing. For example, when I say, we mention that in worship, but I have to correct myself to say, we mention that in morning worship. To recognize in my own speech that Calvary has two services that we offer. And it's been difficult to get people to come to this service because it's a different style of worship than they're used to. There's no organ, there's no hardbound hymnals. Pastors don't wear robes. We worship at night. Things are here more casual and sometimes chaotic. But people, they hear contemporary worship and they just refuse to try it out because that's something that young people do. But I can look at our audience today and tell you it's clear that amazing worship music appeals to everybody. And it's just hard for us humans to see something new and accept it and what it could become. So early in the service, we prayed with knots and rope, marking the storyline of our lives, the ups and the downs, those big events that mark chapter beginnings or chapter endings. And each one of those knots that we made, it marks the old in our life meeting the new. And we marked it in our minds probably because change of all kinds is hard. And it's marked by difficult phases of adjustment in our lives that we remember. I don't think Jesus was saying that the old can never mingle with the new. I just think he was saying that humanity is pretty darn bad at it, and it needs to be handled with care. But one of humanity's struggles in our faith is that our God is always making things new. Always. And in some ways, that's good news for us who make mistakes or who find ourselves in situations where we feel stuck, who feel like we've done irreversible damage. God is always making things new and redeeming impossible situations. Those 4 fraternity brothers who lowered their friend through the roof, they took an impossible situation and created possibility, and Jesus saw their faith in that action. But the problem is that we humans are never good with change. We're just not. And often, God makes things new in ways that we don't expect or we don't like at all. And I think that is one thing that all of humanity has in common, is that we resist change hard. And I put today's story of Jesus in contemporary time, so it could be easier to insert yourself in the story and see how we could react to each thing that was happening. Because our story today is just a series of new things happening, one right after the other. So if there was a figure like Jesus who was gathering a good bit of popularity and staying at the Airbnb up the road, would you give him the time of day? If we were in the room with him and he was bringing a new thing, would you listen to him, or would it be dismissed in your head? Or if you were Levi, sitting on a bench in Cherry Creek State Park, would you follow Jesus if he said, "Follow me," and invite him to your house for dinner? I ask you to reflect on how open to the new that you are. How tightly do you hold on to the tried and true ways of doing things? I know I do. Are you open to a different interpretation of things that you love dearly? And I'd like you to reflect on why. Why do you hold on so tightly to the old? And what fear is underneath that motivates those clenched fists? And as Christians, we worship a God who is making all things new, who is bringing about righteous change that will protect the vulnerable, comfort the afflicted, and liberate the oppressed. And sometimes, honestly, we humans feel like we're getting dragged along to God's plans. But the question for us is, how do we handle the old and the new with care? How do we cherish our tried and true while being open to the new? Amen.